Oh, hi. I was just hanging out today. I was a little bit bored and I was playing with some social media, checking out my Instagram and Twitter account, even Facebook. And it got me thinking about a master's candidate from Western University, Kim Hawkins. She's completing her master's in art and art history and curatorial studies at Western and doing a major research paper on focusing on social media and the impact on museums. As part of her research, she connected with me at the museum. So good morning, Kim. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good, thank you. A master's candidate. That sounds very impressive. Tell us a little bit about the course you're taking.
So right now I'm enrolled at Western in their one-year MA program. So I'm studying to hopefully get my master's in visual arts and curatorial studies. And my focus is looking at social media implications in curating and marketing within the museums and just sort of the trends that are happening within museums and how social media has been affecting that.
That's really, really interesting. How did you land on that topic?
So initially I was studying something very different. I was actually looking at art and trauma and how people coming out of sort of collective trauma have used art as a way to heal. So looking at examples from the Holocaust and from Ireland with the Troubles and from current examples with Syria and things like that. But I was kind of always struggling to hit the mark on that and really get a spark for that passion. And I was constantly following different Instagram hashtags about things like different museum pop-ups and things that the museum itself was putting on and stuff that the AGO were putting on in the ROM. So one of my profs had actually kind of sat down and chatted with me, and as we were talking about it, he was like, well, if that's where your passion's at, that's where you should look at that. And as I kept digging into it and looking up articles, it was really interesting to see that a lot of people have looked at how museums are using social media, but not a lot of people have looked at how social media is having an impact on what the museum is doing and what content they're putting out and how pop-ups are affecting that. So that's sort of how I got on this track.
Yeah, that's great. It's really, really interesting. So just to put this a little bit into context, did you begin your research prior to the pandemic outbreak?
Yes, I did. So I've been researching since September, and I switched into this topic sort of on social media and museums in and around January, but I'd been looking at it as early as October. So definitely before the pandemic, but the pandemic has kind of amped up things in terms of how social media and the internet have to go hand in hand with museum experience now.
So before the pandemic, what steps were museums taking in adapting to an increasingly digital world?
So from what I've noticed, it's very all over the board. Some museums are creating their own Instagram accounts to up that engagement. Some are creating Twitter. Some are still sort of shying away from that. I've worked with a couple of museums throughout my graduate studies, just kind of in passing, and they're struggling to kind of get on that board. But for the most part, a lot of them are really going head on into that engagement and trying to create different experiences. And specifically with the museum here in Kitchener, you guys are doing a fantastic job with Spectrum and then the Spectrum environmental pop-up to create a hashtag and sort of pushing those experiences to become more internet friendly and more Instagram friendly and Twitter friendly. And then there's also the total other side to that where some museums are sort of partnering with things like Google Arts and creating virtual tours. So for instance, the Louvre has one. I know that the Brazilian National Museum, I'm not sure, had also partnered with them in the past to photograph and document all of their collections and their experiences so that those are now tangible online things that you can go through and sort of click and like a Google Maps go through and see everything.
Yeah, so there's kind of three things I'm hearing. There's sort of the traditional now social media of Instagram and Facebook and Twitter getting engagement that way, and more, as you were just describing, sort of digital content, especially since I think that's kind of ramped up a little bit, certainly in our case, since things have been shut down. But then you mentioned the pop-ups themselves, and then you get the integration of all three of those. Have you found that museums are actually that the social media is actually impacting the curation of museums' exhibits and how they plan?
So from what I've seen so far and discussing with the museum with regard to Spectrum, And also even just looking at some of the museums that have sort of cropped up in the last few years. If you look in Toronto, as well as throughout the States, there's the Museum of Illusions. It would be my opinion that yes, I think social media is kind of driving a little bit of a change in how museums are curating to fit more of an experience and more of a photographable opportunity rather than just simply white walls with paintings or very stoic exhibits. There's a lot of interaction and a lot of opportunity for the museums to not only provide something that the public is looking for with regards to those Instagrammable moments, as I've been sort of phrasing them in my research, but also for them to kind of get a little bit of free advertising and a little bit of today's sort of word of mouth advertising, because I would say that hashtags and photos and Instagram posts are becoming the modern day word of mouth advertising. So from what I've noticed, there has been a bit of a trend towards moving towards that more engaged, more Instagrammable, more social media friendly curation.
Yeah. Do you have a couple of examples that you can show us?
Well, right now I can pull up specifically the one that I was talking about, the Museum of Illusions, because it does have a purpose beyond just being a very Instagrammable museum. Its purpose is to sort of showcase illusions, optical illusions, but their Instagram itself, even without searching hashtags, very much demonstrates that it's very experience oriented. So as you can see here on the screen, this is the Instagram of the Museum of Illusions in Toronto. Specifically, I chose Toronto just because it's a little closer to home. But as you begin to scroll, even within the pandemic, they've still been producing content. Specifically, a lot of it has been previous photos. But as you look, there's very, very much spaces within there that fit with the idea of being Instagrammable, of having lots of different views, something of visual interest. In particular, there's a lot of bright colors. And even though this is a permanent museum, it's not just a singular pop-up. You can continue to buy tickets for it right now. It's very much oriented to being able to take photos. As you can see, there's a lot of very, what I would like to say, influencer or Instagram-oriented photos on there. So things like this one.
It's so impressive how people at the Museum of Illusions, how there's lineups in terms of the shareable moments that people want to capture, and people take their time and let somebody in front of them take their photo with their friends or whatever, and then the next group goes through.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I even sort of experienced that just going through the Spectrum exhibit at the museum, where some of those things, especially even if they weren't necessarily controlled, like the ball pit was, or even the balloon room, you had people who would allow you to sort of take your time and experience that on your own, even if you're not taking photos, just so that it wasn't a really bustling, rushed experience.
What other examples? You got a couple more?
29 Rooms is a pretty popular pop-up throughout the States, where essentially it is just various rooms oriented to taking photos, essentially. And what's really interesting is it kind of reminds me a lot of the Museum of Illusions itself, which is more permanent. It also kind of reminds me a little bit of what was happening with the Spectrum exhibit and also the Spectrum pop-up at the museum and the pop-up in Uptown Waterloo prior to all of this going down. It's very interesting to see how similar things are kind of being utilized by different organizations and for different reasons, where you have, for 29 Rooms, the goal is very much to get people in and take their photos. It's a very flashy, catchy exhibit. And similarly, when you take a look at the color tripping hashtag from the museum's exhibit Spectrum, you've got very similar photos coming up, similar experiences, but in comparison, this is all artist-based and artwork-based.
That was important to us, that it was artist-based. Do you see any trends from, I mean, Museum of Illusions is definitely themed, but in terms of the pop-ups, 29 Rooms or some of the others that are out there, do you see them maturing or morphing over to becoming more themed rather than just a quick pop-up for shareable moments?
Yes, To answer that question, yeah, I've noticed that a lot of pop-ups are starting to sort of take a stance in terms of things with regards to environmental issues, or even if it's not necessarily taking a stance, but looking at a very specific topic. Like there was a Dr. Seuss pop-up as well. And so they're getting more specified rather than just being one sort of very much like, we're going to pack in everything we can that seems fun. They take a topic and they work out from there, whether that be the environment or a favorite author or a movie, or even moving towards looking at having your admissions be a donation to something. So having that topic be the focus. So I think pop-ups sort of started as a very just fun and engaging experience, an opportunity to look at something that was very visually appealing. And now it's moving into an area where that sort of novelty is worn off. So there has to be some more substantial tie between the exhibits. It can't just be, here's a bunch of fun things for you to go look through.
Yeah.
It's targeted.
So this isn't a fad. I think we agree this is a trend, that this will increasingly infiltrate museums and so on. Do you think it's a good thing? Do you think this is the future for museums? And how does it impact them demographically as well?
I think that it's definitely a good thing for museums in the sense that it's opening it up to new demographics. I mean, there are a lot of people who are around my age or a little bit younger, or sometimes even a little bit older. So sort of in that millennial and like younger age, where museums, especially traditional institutional museums like national galleries and national science museums, don't necessarily have the same appeal as something like a pop-up would, or something very interactive and experiential. I think that these pop-ups really can teach those larger institutions a little bit, because there is something to be learned about how to engage your audience and how to utilize where they already are, being social media, as a way to market to them and to engage them. So I definitely think this is kind of more than a fad, it's a trend, and I think it's staying. And especially with how COVID-19 has affected things, I think one thing that's very great about some pop-ups is that they do have that ability to limit, and they do plan out, okay, we want everyone to have their own time in this specific room, so we only give access to X number of people a day. And that might be something that museums might have to move towards as they're starting to open up again, is really consciously thinking about how many people they can take in before it becomes too many. And because of that, something similar to a pop-up where you walk through different rooms and you have that interest, that visual pull, that spark of like, wow, this excitement, that might be something that museums can kind of learn from and pull from to sort of keep their business going, their interests going, and get sort of a new audience in even after all of the COVID-19 pandemic calms down.
Interactive, experiential, and shareable. That seems to be the recipe.
Yep.
Kim, when is your paper due, and when do you find out how you did on it?
So I have a draft due at the end of this month, and then my final is due at the end of June. And then it's just a little bit of a waiting game. It'll be graded by a number of professors. And so for mine, I chose to do an internship throughout the year. Because I wanted to do that, I was in a course-based. So rather than this being a thesis I'm defending, I'm lucky that I just get to have it marked. So it saves a little bit of that pressure, but it also gave me the opportunity to work with two awesome institutions throughout the year. So that was great.
Well, listen, thank you very, very much. This has been really, really informative, insightful, and good luck. And love to hear how it all turns out when you get your final marks.
Thank you very much.
So thank you, Kim, and we'll talk to you again soon.